For more than a century, doctors called it useless. Medical students were taught it was a leftover, an evolutionary scrap with no real job to do, something you could remove without consequence. And for a while, some surgeons did exactly that, just in case, during unrelated operations. Then, in the 21st century, scientists discovered the appendix has independently evolved from scratch in more than 30 separate branches of the mammal family tree. Nature does not bother reinventing something more than 30 times, unless it's doing something useful. Appendicitis is one of the most common reasons anyone on Earth ends up in emergency surgery. Somewhere between 5 and 9% of people will develop it at some point in their life, and it remains one of the leading causes of acute abdominal emergencies worldwide, responsible for hundreds of thousands of operations every year. And yet the organ at the center of all of it, a thin, finger-sized pouch attached to the large intestine, spent most of modern medical history being treated as an afterthought, a structure doctors understood how to remove long before they understood what, if anything, it was actually for. The appendix shows up in anatomical history earlier than most people expect. Leonardo da Vinci is generally credited with producing the first anatomical drawing that clearly depicts it, sometime around 1492, tucked into his broader studies of human dissection. But it was the Italian physician Jacopo Berengario da Carpi who gave the structure its first real written description in 1521, in one of the earliest printed anatomy textbooks based on actual human dissection rather than centuries-old assumption. Berengario and the anatomists who followed him settled on a name that has stuck ever since, vermiform, from the Latin for worm-shaped, describing its narrow, tapering, worm-like appearance dangling off the beginning of the large intestine. Before Renaissance-era anatomists like Berengario worked directly from human dissection, ancient physicians such as Galen, working centuries earlier in the Roman world, had built much of Western medicine's anatomical foundation on the dissection of animals rather than humans, since human dissection was largely forbidden. That gap left ancient medicines with essentially no accurate picture of the appendix at all. It simply wasn't part of the anatomical map doctors were working from for well over 1,000 years, until direct human dissection became more widely accepted in European medical schools during the 14th and 15th centuries. In many plant-eating mammals, the cecum most closely related to the human version is enormous, sometimes making up a significant portion of the entire digestive tract, packed with bacteria that break down tough plant cellulose the animal's own body can't digest on its own. In humans, by contrast, the cecum is comparatively tiny, and the appendix sits at its end almost like a narrow afterthought, a stark size difference that would eventually become one of the strongest pieces of evidence anatomists pointed to when arguing the human version had lost its original digestive job entirely. For a long time after Berengario's description, naming the appendix was about as far as anatomy went. Early anatomists could see it, draw it, and describe exactly where it sat in the body, but they had almost no way of knowing what it was doing there, if anything. Dissection could map the body's architecture in extraordinary detail centuries before medicine had any real understanding of physiology, immunology, or the microscopic world happening inside an organ that looked, on the surface, like a dead end with no obvious purpose. That gap, knowing exactly where something is while having no idea why it exists, would end up defining the appendix's reputation for the next 400 years. For roughly 3 centuries after Berengario named it, doctors had essentially no coherent theory connecting the appendix to the violent abdominal pain that would occasionally kill an otherwise healthy young person within days. When patients did die of what we now recognize as a ruptured appendix, physicians typically attributed it to a broader, vaguer condition centered around the cecum, the nearby pouch of the large intestine, calling it typhlitis or peritaphitis. Inflammation of the general area, not of the appendix specifically. Adding to the confusion, the symptoms doctors were seeing: fever, abdominal pain, a patient who seemed fine one week and gravely ill the next, overlapped heavily with typhoid fever, a genuinely common and deadly disease of the era spread through contaminated water. Without the tools to distinguish a localized abdominal infection from a systemic bacterial illness, physicians frequently lumped both under vague diagnostic labels, further delaying any specific understanding of the appendix's role. Without a specific diagnosis, there was no clear reason to operate on the appendix itself, and abdominal surgery in general was, for most of this period, close to a death sentence on its own, long before anesthesia or antiseptic technique existed. The first recorded successful removal of an appendix happened almost by accident. In 1735, a London surgeon named Claudius Amiand was operating on an 11-year-old boy for a hernia when he discovered the boy's appendix, perforated and lodged inside the hernia sac, apparently pierced by a swallowed pin. Amiand removed it on the spot, and the boy survived. the first documented successful appendectomy in history, more than 150 years before anyone understood that a healthy appendix could become dangerously inflamed entirely on its own, with no hernia and no swallowed object involved at all. For most of the 18th and 19th centuries, that case remained closer to a surgical curiosity than a lesson anyone acted on systematically. And once appendectomy did eventually become an accepted operation in the early 20th century, medicine swung to something like the opposite extreme. With no strong theory of what the organ was actually for, and a growing surgical confidence following germ theory and anesthesia, some surgeons began removing perfectly healthy appendices during unrelated abdominal operations purely as a precaution, on the reasoning that an organ nobody could explain the purpose of couldn't really be worth the risk of leaving behind. This practice, sometimes called incidental appendectomy, became common enough in the early 20th century that, for a period, having your appendix removed during an unrelated operation purely as a precaution was almost treated as routine housekeeping. An accepted norm that only faded once later research began seriously questioning whether the organ actually served no purpose at all. An organ doctors couldn't explain became an organ many of them simply decided not to bother keeping. That casual approach didn't fully fade until well into the second half of the 20th century, as follow-up research increasingly suggested that people who'd had their appendix removed earlier in life showed slightly different patterns of gut infection recovery and immune markers compared to those who hadn't. Early, imperfect hints that the organ wasn't as disposable as generations of surgeons had assumed. The turning point came from a Harvard pathologist named Reginald Fitz, who in 1886 published a paper that finally untangled the confusion. Fitz had spent years examining autopsy and case records of patients who had died from what doctors were calling paratyphlitis, and he found something the field had been missing. In case after case, the true source of the infection wasn't the cecum at all, but the small, easily overlooked appendix hanging off it. Fitz's paper drew on a review of more than 250 documented cases, an unusually large and systematic body of evidence for the time, which is part of why his conclusions carried enough weight to shift medical consensus rather than being dismissed as one pathologist's opinion. Fitz proposed a new specific diagnosis for the condition and gave it the name still used today: appendicitis. More importantly, he argued that if it was caught early enough before the appendix ruptured and spread infection through the abdomen, surgical removal could actually save the patient's life rather than being attempted only as a desperate, usually futile last resort. 3 years later, a New York surgeon named Charles McBurney built directly on Fitz's work. McBurney identified a precise, reliable point on the lower right side of the abdomen where tenderness reliably signaled appendicitis, a location still taught to every medical student today as McBurney's point, and developed a surgical technique for removing the appendix through a small targeted incision at that exact spot. Between Fitz's diagnosis and McBurney's technique, appendicitis went, within roughly a decade, from a condition doctors couldn't reliably identify to one they could diagnose with real precision and treat with a specific, repeatable operation. Within a generation, Fitz and McBurney's approach spread from American and British hospitals to medical schools across Europe and eventually much of the world, standardizing what had been, just decades earlier, a fragmented and often fatal guessing game into one of the most consistently taught surgical procedures in modern medicine. What actually convinced the wider public that this new surgery was legitimate, rather than experimental or dangerous, was a single, very famous patient. In June of 1902, days before his own coronation, King Edward VII of the United Kingdom developed severe abdominal pain that was diagnosed as appendicitis. His surgeon, Frederick Treves, told the king plainly that without an operation, the coronation would proceed over a corpse. Edward initially refused, reportedly saying the ceremony could not be postponed for him, until Treves made clear there would be no ceremony to postpone for if he didn't operate. By the time Treves operated on the king in 1902, appendectomy already benefited from 2 other major medical advances that made it dramatically safer than it would have been even 20 years earlier: reliable general anesthesia and antiseptic surgical technique, both of which had transformed abdominal surgery from an almost universally fatal last resort into a survivable, repeatable procedure. The coronation was delayed. The surgery was performed successfully, and the king recovered and was crowned weeks later. Edward's case became so well known that some medical historians have credited it with directly boosting public trust in surgery generally, not just for appendicitis, at a moment when many patients still associated any operation with near certain death. For most of the 20th century, the dominant scientific explanation for the appendix came from an idea Charles Darwin himself proposed back in 1871 in The Descent of Man. Darwin suggested the appendix was a vestigial structure, a shrunken leftover of a larger cecum that human ancestors once used to digest tough, fibrous plant material, a structure that lost its original job as the human diet and digestive system evolved, but never fully disappeared. For well over 100 years, vestigial organ, no real function became the standard textbook answer, and it's the version many people alive today were taught in school. That view has been seriously challenged in the 21st century. In 2007, researchers proposed what became known as the safe house hypothesis. The appendix appears to function as a protected reservoir for epithelial gut bacteria, tucked away from the main flow of the digestive tract. The hypothesis was formally proposed by a team led by Duke surgeon Randall Bollinger, published in the Journal of Theoretical Biology, and it reframed decades of assumptions almost overnight within the scientific community, even though it took years longer to filter into general medical education and public awareness. If a severe gut infection or bout of diarrheal illness wipes out the healthy bacterial population in the rest of the intestines, the theory holds that the appendix can help reseed and restore that population afterward, acting as a kind of biological backup drive for the gut microbiome. The appendix is also now known to contain a significant concentration of lymphoid tissue, the kind of immune tissue involved in training the body's immune responses. That lymphoid tissue is most concentrated in the appendix during childhood and early adulthood, gradually thinning out with age, a pattern that fits neatly, with the idea of an organ playing an active role in shaping the immune system and gut bacteria early in life, rather than simply sitting unused. Perhaps the most striking evidence came from a 2013 comparative anatomy study, which examined the appendix across hundreds of mammal species and found that it has evolved independently at least 30 separate times throughout mammalian history, appearing, disappearing, and reappearing across completely unrelated branches of the evolutionary tree. Structures that serve no real purpose don't typically get reinvented by evolution over and over again in unrelated lineages. Whatever the appendix is actually doing, it appears to matter enough that nature keeps building something like it, again and again from scratch. Since then, additional research has continued to build on both threads of evidence, the microbiome safe house role and the immune training function, reinforcing the same basic conclusion from different directions. Medical textbooks and curricula have been slow to fully catch up, but the scientific consensus has shifted decisively away from the purely vestigial framing that dominated for most of the 20th century. Today, appendicitis remains one of the most common surgical emergencies in the world. Lifetime risk estimates generally place it somewhere between 5 and 9% of the population, and it is most common in people between the ages of 10 and 30, though it can occur at any age. Rates vary somewhat by region and diet, with historically lower incidence reported in parts of the world with higher fiber traditional diets, though appendicitis occurs on every inhabited continent and across every population studied. Before Fitz and McBurney's work standardized early diagnosis and surgery, mortality from appendicitis was severe. Historical estimates from the pre-antibiotic, pre-early surgery era place fatality rates for ruptured appendicitis as high as 50% or more in some reported series, largely because the condition wasn't recognized and operated on until peritonitis had already set in. With modern diagnosis, imaging, antibiotics, and surgical technique, mortality from appendicitis today is under 1% when it is treated promptly. In the United States alone, roughly 300,000 appendectomies are performed every year, making it one of the most frequently performed emergency surgeries in the country, and similar patterns hold across most of the developed world. Interestingly, appendicitis rates themselves have shifted over time. Epidemiological records suggest the condition became noticeably more common in industrialized nations beginning in the 19th century. Around the same period, diets shifted toward more processed, lower fiber food, and some researchers have proposed a connection between reduced dietary fiber and increased appendicitis risk, echoing similar patterns seen with several other digestive conditions, though the exact relationship is still debated among epidemiologists today. Modern appendectomy is now most commonly performed laparoscopically, through a handful of small incisions rather than the larger open surgery McBurney pioneered, typically allowing patients to go home within a day or two. Laparoscopic appendectomy first became widely practiced in the 1980s and has since become the dominant approach across most of the developed world, valued for smaller scars, faster recovery, and lower rates of wound infection compared to the open surgical technique McBurney originally developed. More recently, research has even begun to question whether surgery is always necessary at all. A major clinical trial known as the CODA trial, funded by the National Institutes of Health and published in 2020, found that for many patients with uncomplicated appendicitis, meaning the appendix hadn't yet ruptured, treatment with antibiotics alone could be a safe and effective alternative to surgery for a significant portion of patients, sparing them an operation entirely. It hasn't replaced surgery as the standard approach, particularly for more severe or complicated cases, but it represents a genuine shift in how doctors think about an organ that, not that long ago, was being removed on a hunch just to be safe. Researchers are also increasingly interested in cases where the appendix appears linked to other conditions later in life, including some preliminary research into its potential role in conditions like Parkinson's disease, where certain studies have observed differences in disease patterns between people who have and haven't had an appendectomy. An active and still unsettled area of ongoing research, not a settled conclusion. Put the two eras side by side and the shift is stark. Before, a patient with abdominal pain from a ruptured appendix had, in many historical accounts, roughly even odds of surviving at all because the underlying condition wasn't understood well enough to be diagnosed until it was often too late, and abdominal surgery itself carried serious risks of its own from infection and blood loss. A young, otherwise healthy person could die within days of symptoms that today would be resolved with a same-day outpatient procedure and a return to normal life within a couple of weeks. Surgeons operated on the general region and hoped for the best, without a reliable way to know exactly where the problem was or whether their intervention was even reaching it. Diagnosis itself tells much of the same story. Before Fitz's work, the only reliable way doctors ever definitively identified the true cause of a fatal case was after death, during autopsy. By then, obviously, far too late to help the patient it was diagnosed in. After, a patient today with the same symptoms can typically expect diagnosis through physical examination and imaging within hours, a laparoscopic procedure lasting under an hour, 1 or 2 nights in the hospital at most, and a mortality risk under 1% when treated promptly. Modern imaging such as ultrasound or CT scans allows doctors to confirm appendicitis with strong confidence before ever making an incision and to just as confidently rule it out in patients whose pain turns out to be something else entirely. A level of precision that also finally ended the era of surgeons removing perfectly healthy appendices out of pure caution, since there was no longer a need to guess. A surgeon working in the 1870s might operate on a dozen suspected cases across an entire career and watch most of them die regardless of what was attempted. A surgeon today can expect to perform a successful appendectomy in under an hour, several times in a single week, with a patient walking out of the hospital within days, the same basic human anatomy treated by 2 versions of medicine that might as well belong to different centuries. The entire arc, from a mysterious and frequently fatal condition to one of the most routine and reliably survivable operations in modern surgery, happened almost entirely within about a 50-year window between Fitz's 1886 paper and the widespread adoption of his and McBurney's methods across the medical world in the early 20th century. None of this means appendicitis has become harmless. In parts of the world without reliable access to emergency surgery, or in cases where symptoms are missed or dismissed, a ruptured appendix can still be fatal within days, exactly the way it was in Fitz's era. The disease hasn't gotten weaker. Access to fast, accurate diagnosis is still the entire difference between a routine recovery and a genuine emergency. For 150 years, the appendix carried a kind of quiet reputation as medicine's punchline. The organ doctors joked about, dismissed, and sometimes removed without much of a second thought, simply because nobody could explain what it was for. It turns out that we don't understand its purpose, and it has no purpose were never actually the same statement, even though medicine treated them as interchangeable for most of a century. The appendix's real story isn't really about an organ at all. It's a reminder of how much of the human body, even the parts anatomists mapped in precise detail 500 years ago, we are still, quietly, in the middle of figuring out.